Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Stimson Center. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. My name is Aditi Goror. I'm the director of the Protecting Civilians in Conflict program here at the Stimson Center. Our program's work focuses on really putting civilians at the center of analysis when looking at ways to resolve international conflict and trying to find ways for the international community to do a better job of protecting civilians caught in the midst of violence. It's part of Stimson's broader program of work supporting atrocities prevention, conflict resolution, and strengthening international humanitarian law. When it comes to violence against civilians, of course, there are a few places in the world more devastating than Yemen, a country that sadly is in the headlines far too little. You all know the statistics, so I won't repeat them, except to highlight that in December 2017, the OHCHR had documented more than 5,000 civilians killed and 9,000 civilians injured in the fighting in Yemen. These are extraordinary and appalling figures, and it's clear that more must be done to protect civilians from violence. This discussion around protecting civilians in Yemen, a critical part of that is a discussion around accountability and justice. Accountability and justice are core to protecting civilians, to reinforcing IHL, and to deterring future perpetrators of violence, which is why I'm so pleased to welcome this incredibly distinguished group of experts here today to talk about accountability, justice, and reparations in the Yemen crisis. My thanks to the American Society of International Law and to the Washington Foreign Law Society for organizing this important discussion. And with that, let me hand over to Mark Agras to kick things off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aditi. I'm Mark Agrast. I'm the Executive Director of the American Society of International Law and a member of the Board of Governors of the Washington Foreign Law Society. And so on behalf of both of those sponsoring organizations, I'm pleased to join our colleagues at the Stimson Center in welcoming you to this program on the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. I also would like to welcome those who are viewing the session by live stream and on video. I would also like to thank the organizers of this program, Ida Dijkstal and Rodney Dixon, who are both here. And Rodney, I believe, is going to be moderating the second session this afternoon. They have convened a distinguished group of experts who are going to try to bring some clarity to this urgent, complex, and largely underreported situation. As many of you know, the present conflict dates to 2014, when Houthi rebels and forces loyal to ex-President Saleh took control of the capital and much of the country. In 2015, a Saudi-led coalition intervened in an effort to return former President Hadi to power. Since then, according to reports by the United Nations, leading international NGOs, and the U.S. Department of State, thousands have been killed and thousands more have been wounded in the conflict, largely as a result of unremitting airstrikes and shelling. Millions of civilians are at risk of starvation and disease, and the crisis has been exacerbated by blockades of humanitarian aid. The American Society of International Law does not advocate for policy or political positions. Our mission is to foster knowledge of international law and to promote the establishment and maintenance of international relations on the basis of law and justice. Put in that context, the unfolding crisis in Yemen represents both a human tragedy and a failure of diplomacy and the rule of law. We and our co-sponsors hope that today's sessions will help our viewers to understand what is at stake in this conflict, what can be done to end it, and what steps can be taken to provide ultimate redress to its victims. It's hard to imagine anyone who's better equipped to address these issues and to help frame this discussion than our distinguished keynote speaker. Stephen J. Rapp served as U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice from 2009 to 2015. In that role, he coordinated U.S. government support to international criminal tribunals, including the International Criminal Court, as well as to hybrid and national courts responsible for prosecuting persons charged with genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. From 2007 to 2009, Ambassador Rapp served as prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, where he led the prosecution of former Liberian President Charles Taylor. His office achieved the first convictions in history on crimes against humanity charges for sexual slavery and forced marriage, and for attacks on peacekeepers and recruitment and use of child soldiers in violations of international humanitarian law. From 2001 to 2007, he served as senior trial attorney and chief of prosecutions at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, where he led the trial team that achieved the first convictions against leaders of the mass media for the crime of direct and public incitement to commit genocide. We're very honored to have Ambassador Rapp with us. We've asked him to speak for up to 15 minutes, at which point he has agreed to respond to 10 to 15 minutes of questions from the floor. Please welcome Ambassador Stephen Rapp.
Well, thank you very much, Mark, for that introduction, and thank you very much to the American Society for International Law, the Washington Foreign Law Society, and also the Stimson Center for sponsoring this timely forum. As has already been described by the first two speakers, this is a humanitarian crisis in Yemen. Indeed, as has been said, the worst humanitarian crisis in the world, and that's saying something given the horrors in Iraq and Syria, Myanmar, and South Sudan. But that's because we have so many people at risk. 3 million people have already been driven from their homes. 8.4 million are in serious threat of starvation and famine. And if this offensive for Hudaydah continues, and that port is cut off, and the ability to deliver food and medicine to 3/4 of the country is significantly hindered or stopped. Indeed, 22 million people face starvation and problems with disease and public health. This is a conflict in which the numbers that have been killed in the combat, so to speak, or in kinetic action, I think is approaching some 10,000, which is less than in many of the situations in the world. On the other hand, this doesn't count the many that have already succumbed because of the denial of humanitarian access of food and medicine. We saw the story in the Post in the last several days about the 3-year-old in Mocha who died of an entirely treatable infection. He'd be alive if he were living in Washington or in Riyadh or Dubai, but he's dead, and his father was forced to put him on the motorcycle and take him back home to be buried. And the numbers that have also succumbed have been estimated to be certainly in the thousands. Why is it? Because this civil conflict is being fought with great brutality against the civilian population. And it's intriguing to me as someone that follows conflicts, and conflicts and civil ones are always horrendous, and one always sees the loss of innocent life. And quite often in dealing with situations in Africa, one hears, well, we don't have sophisticated weapons, we can't do the sort of targeting, the kind of things that Western militaries can do, and some of this is just inevitable in the nature of the conflict. Or you have other situations where there are no forces on the ground, and the intervention is through air power, and quite often the intelligence is inadequate. But this is a situation in which the major coalition that's active on the ground and in the air, the Saudi-led coalition with the UAE and other countries, is spending literally millions of dollars a day, and could be focusing their attention and fighting this as more of a force-on-force kind of conflict. But the way it's being fought leads us to infer, certainly from my observation and from study of it, is that the civilian population is being punished in areas controlled by the Houthi government in Sana'a. That the war is not being fought with precision in terms of hitting military contracts, military targets. As you all know, and I mean not all of you, but I mean obviously here at the Stimson Center there's a great focus on the laws of armed conflict. And since the Lieber Code during the American Civil War, the rules that are observed and that have been expanded and then enforced in criminal prosecutions in Nuremberg and The Hague and Arusha and Freetown, and certainly monitored and engaged on by the International Committee of the Red Cross, is that in an armed conflict one needs to always follow the rules, one, of distinction, to distinguish between military and civilian targets, to use proportionate force to take out those civilian, to take out the military targets and to avoid civilian harm. Of course, that's an analysis that is in shades of gray, but in this situation, it's in frankly sharp colors. And then finally, one exercises necessary precautions in order to avoid attacks on the civilians or loss of civilian life, infrastructure, or humanitarian access. I mean, if you look at the studies that have been done, and there was one by a UN panel of experts that has not been formally released, that was disclosed to the Security Council in January of 2016, but then published in The Guardian. This group of experts found that the coalition, the Saudi-led coalition, had conducted airstrikes targeting civilians and civilian objects. They looked at 119 different sorties, including camps of internally displaced persons and refugees, civilian gatherings, including weddings, civilian vehicles, including buses, civilian residential areas, medical facilities, schools, mosques, markets, factory and food storage warehouses, other essential civilian infrastructures such as the airport in Sana'a and the port in Hodeidah, and domestic transit routes. And many of the attacks involved multiple attacks on the civilian objects. Indeed, these sort of double tap attacks where there's an attack that kills civilians, and then when the humanitarian and health workers arrive to provide aid and to take people to hospitals or wherever they can get treatment, another attack to essentially destroy those that are trying to help their fellow human beings. Now, of course, they didn't have access to the ground in Yemen, and they studied it through satellite imagery of cities before and after the attacks. The other thing that's disturbing and puts me in mind of what happened in Sri Lanka at the end of a very brutal conflict in which my own office, when I became ambassador at large in September 2009, I did a study, and then we led efforts together with the U.S. State Department and our allies to eventually get some international inquiries and some promises in terms of transitional justice after the change in government in 2015 in Sri Lanka. But one of the things that we had there was, as we saw, an actual effort to suppress this rebellion by denying food and medicine to the civilian population, and to constantly underestimate the numbers of people that are receiving that food and medicine, to the extent that people were enfeebled and weakened and succumbed to illness or injury, and constant efforts to increase that flow was always met with resistance and obstruction. And as Amnesty International reports, I think in this press release it's described, that's in today's packet, we see some of the same kind of things happening in Yemen. Now, the next question is, where do we go from here? One, I should note that finally last September, the UN Human Rights Council, finally with U.S. support, supported and mandated a commission, not a formal commission of inquiry like that was pushed by our Dutch allies, but a group of eminent persons to examine the situation in Yemen and make findings about violations and abuses and the surrounding circumstances. That report is due in August, in just 2 months, and in September it'll be presented orally and in written form before the Human Rights Council, and there'll be an opportunity to extend that mandate and frankly to expand it, but more on that in a few moments. What needs to be done now? And clearly we're at a critical stage with the attacks, with the offensive against Hodeidah. And people have described this as a situation where what is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world can become truly a catastrophe. We've already had the coalition engaging in the last 2 weeks in the bombardment of the port and civilian areas, the taking of the airport, and now we're looking at a situation where the offensive into the built-up areas of a city of 600,000 is beginning. And the impact of that on that civilian population and on that vital port in terms of getting food, medicine, and everything else to 3/4 of the population at Yemen could then reach a point of real catastrophe. There are efforts to stop this. There's some talk that it may be possible to essentially have the withdrawal of the Sana'a Houthi government's forces from that area, the UN takeover of the port. Martin Griffiths is due in Aden tomorrow to discuss that with Prime Minister Hadi. There is a possibility that could go forward. On the other hand, there's pressure in the coalition to proceed in the hope that a military victory can be achieved. At this point, the question is, where's the United States? Where are the Western allies? Are we all in support of this offensive with the potential catastrophic kind of effect in the hope that there can be a military victory? And what does a military victory mean in a country that's 60 to 65% Sunni and 30 to 35% Shia? Clearly, it has to be something that begins a negotiated process, a power-sharing arrangement, a peaceful transition without sowing further dragon's teeth that caused the situation to continue in conflict for years and indeed decades to come. The first thing, obviously, is we need to do all we can to cut off that flow of weapons. Congress, a bipartisan group of House members, have been pushing for the U.S. to stop logistical, military, and diplomatic support. There's some lack of clarity of how engaged we are, but I think most of us have seen us involved in supporting the naval blockade in the past, and frankly, in the recent weeks, providing encouragement to the coalition forces. Clearly, the weapons that are being provided by the United States and other Western allies are being used in these brutal attacks that are costing the lives of civilian men, women, and children. Congress has asked for a clarification from Secretary Mattis, this bipartisan group, and for the U.S. to use all tools at its command. I mean, clearly, it's unarguable. When the perpetrators don't have the arms and ammunition, the civilians can't be killed and maimed, and the rapidly spiraling humanitarian crisis can be forestalled. The U.S. shouldn't, and other countries shouldn't be involved in supporting those who are showing, as we've seen from the UN report in 2016, as we've seen from the other neutral reporting, violation of the laws of armed conflict. Mark mentioned my own work in the past as a prosecutor in international cases. I prosecuted former President Charles Taylor of Liberia, who was successfully prosecuted, convicted of 11 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity, now serving a 50-year sentence in a UN-backed court. And he was convicted not for the crimes he committed in his own country of Liberia, but by providing aid and support to the campaign of atrocities being conducted by the RUF in the next country over, in Sierra Leone. So it's a dangerous thing to be supporting those and one can find themselves in a situation of individual criminal responsibility when one does that in support of those that are violating the arms of war, the laws of war. Then, of course, we need to investigate these properly. You know, we're in a situation where, as I described in 2016, where this group of experts that was then organized by the United Nations and that reported to the Security Council didn't have access to the ground. We've got now this group of eminent persons appointed by the President of the Human Rights Council, or actually by the High Commissioner under a mandate from the UN Human Rights Council. That mandate needs to be strengthened. Now, as I said last time when this was pushed, it was pushed by our Dutch allies, and several others. Initially, the U.S. Was opposing the establishment of a commission of inquiry, believing, I think without much hope, that the commission established by the government in Aden would investigate this properly, and there's certainly no evidence that that's occurring or can occur. Eventually, we compromised in favor of this commission of eminent persons, and it's been appointed and is now doing as good a job as it can with a limited mandate and with limited resources. This mandate needs to be extended. It could become a commission of inquiry like we have on Syria, as we've had in North Korea, as we've had in a number of situations. Of course, the United States has now left the Human Rights Council, and as I understand, actually given instructions that we're not even going to participate in negotiations from our observer position, which I think is highly unfortunate. It's another example of undermining our ability to support our values, because we don't win everything, we're going to walk out and not participate. And we all know that the United States has been able, during the course of the last 7 or 8 years, as I described on Sri Lanka, as I described on North Korea, Myanmar, Eritrea, Syria, a whole variety of situations where the Security Council was divided and where there would have been no commission of inquiry to accomplish it in the Human Rights Council. And because of the one situation of Israel where the U.S. is disturbed about the permanent agenda of the Human Rights Council, we're unwilling now to participate and take the kind of leadership that has been our history in favor of accountability for the laws of armed conflict and for international human rights. But we can still signal to our allies that we're not opposing. And we think that it's time, it is right, to have a stronger commission in this area, and use whatever leadership and whatever levers we have. And certainly as we deal with our friends in Europe, with the French, who in the past have been with us in pulling back from a robust mandate, we can be encouraging those countries to build it to a stronger mandate. My ideal, which is something that's developed now out of this independent mechanism for Syria, but recently has been extended to the Human Rights Council's Commission for South Sudan, is to actually give it a mandate that relates to criminal accountability, which specifically mandates the Commission to gather and preserve evidence and to make it available for future prosecutions. When you do that, you send a signal to the perpetrators that they're being watched, that tomorrow they could find themselves on an arrest warrant, maybe not at an international court, but by a court in a third country, as we've seen recently with the head of Air Force intelligence from Syria, with an arrest warrant from Germany based upon his mass torture of the civilian opposition in the detention facilities owned and constructed and maintained by Syrian Air Force intelligence. So these are the kind of things that can be done if you've got the solid evidence. And we need to be using the UN Human Rights Council, and to the extent that we can participate even as a non-member, in making sure that this occurs. Of course, the attacks are not limited to military attacks. It's been credibly alleged that many human rights supporters and journalists who've spoken out against the actions of parties to the conflict have been disappeared or arbitrarily detained in prisons run by UAE forces and others, and these abuses need to be exposed and investigated in a manner that will lay the groundwork for future trials. It's important to note that there are violations on all sides in this conflict, and we've certainly seen these instances of the launch of missiles toward Riyadh, which are obviously violations of the laws of war because they're not targeting a military target, but they're intended to terrorize and intimidate a civilian population. And any violation of war, the laws of war, needs to be investigated. I note the Human Rights Watch analysis on a series of attacks that they completed in March of 2017 found sort of a proportion of about 8 to 1. 8 violations by the coalition for 1 by the Sana government. But those can be serious violations, and every violation by one side actually increases the chance the other side feels licensed to do something even worse. Our problem here is that there's the perception that these crimes can be committed with impunity. This has been aided by the liberal provision of arms and assistance to the main actors by the United States and other governments. This is what has led to the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And we need to take action now along these lines to stop that flow of weapons, to lay the foundation for criminal accountability if we're going to prevent this crisis from becoming a catastrophe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stephen. You've also set a wonderful example for our panel by keeping us on schedule. So we do have time for a few questions from the floor. I believe there are microphones somewhere. Does someone have the mics? Yes, there are 2 microphones. What I'll ask is that when I call on you, please wait for the microphone to reach you, because this is being live streamed. We want to be sure that everybody who's watching and listening can hear your question. When you get the mic, please state a question. Do not make a speech, so that we have time for a few of these. And please identify yourself and the institution with which you're affiliated. So, questions? Yes, ma'am.
Thanks very much for an extraordinary presentation of the situation. My question has to do with this issue of accountability. You've spoken of the variety of potential violations of international law. Speaking specifically to the role of the United States, where it includes both the provision of arms, the participation in providing in-air refueling, etc., what suggestions do you have for what kind of political action might go forward in this country that could make possible the kind of information gathering, etc., aimed at holding U.S. officials, military or political, accountable for their violations? Thank you. Oh, sorry, I'm Phyllis Bennis from the Institute for Policy Studies.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your question, Phyllis. It's a challenging one, and we know certainly from the example of the use of torture or enhanced interrogation, as it was called, the clear violation of our obligations of the Convention Against Torture and international law, that holding individuals to account in the United States, even for very specific violations, is not easy. But I do think that one needs to be developing the evidence, supporting documentation by international groups that really dig into the questions of what assistance is being provided, what kind of notice of violations are occurring, to sort of expose the potential for criminal responsibility being levied. And as much as, as ambassador at large, I traveled to, I was always proud of my travel schedule, 220 days a year, and went 1.5 million miles to 87 countries over 6 years. Americans travel abroad and could find themselves potentially questioned on these things and facing accountability if that evidence is there. We don't like it. And the way to avoid it is to live up to our values and our leadership on these issues, and that means exercising our influence to mitigate the problems here. I know when we were trying Taylor, and there had been earlier a decision in the IC, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. An individual who was the chief of staff of Serbia was convicted at trial and eventually acquitted on appeal in a very controversial question. And the issue is, how responsible was he for the crimes being committed with the arms that he was providing to Karadzic and Mladic in Srebrenica to the 3-year-long horrendous siege of Sarajevo and all the crimes in the municipalities. And in the end, he was acquitted, but it's a very close and debatable case. The following year, we had the appeal in Taylor and basically rejected that rule and said that if you aid and abet with knowledge of the crimes or with reason to know what the crimes are, and your assistance is substantial and essentially enabling. It can't be just a little help here and a little help there. It's got to be the kind of sine qua non kind of thing. So it's not that easy to hold an external actor to account. But where one can look at a situation and say, without that help, without that aid, and clearly with knowledge, the assistance is provided, you do run the risk of criminal liability. And these are things that need to be understood and followed. And the best way to build it is to obtain neutral, investigative, obtain information about what's done, the orders, the knowledge, the reports, all of that kind of thing. The more evidence you have, the greater the strength of a prosecution, and the idea that that's being done and being pursued can, particularly in the case of countries that know what they're doing and really do want to stay out of trouble, affect the conduct. I mean, already, and I'm proud of a lot of what we do in the United States in terms of our military justice and our targeting and the analysis that we make in targeting when we end up in built-up areas in support of any kind of military operation in which we're directly involved. It's not perfect, but we do have advisors that are in there telling people that's illegal, that's not illegal. And in these situations of aiding others, I'm not sure that same kind of analysis is occurring, and it needs to. Oh, go ahead. You can go ahead. You want to do the... okay, yes. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm Rachel Carrillo with the United Nations Association, Boulder County, Colorado, actually. Okay. And my question is relating to the U.S. leaving the Human Rights Council, and somehow follows on Phyllis's question about what can we do as U.S. Americans to help regain our, reach out to the administration in influencing and making sure we're back seated at that council, because, as you said, we are completely forfeiting our influence with these multiple crises around the world. And if we are not upholding our values at the United Nations, how can we possibly hold up our values here at home?
Well, a very, very good question. And, I came from, sort of a grassroots background. I was in politics in my home state of Iowa and was in the state legislature, and then became a federal prosecutor, and then made this transition 17 years ago to the international level, and then sat in the State Department for 6 years and went to senior level meetings and experienced this phenomenon in America where our foreign policy is not something except at times a particular crisis that is engaged in too much in our politics. People, of course, politics is local. Questions of what's happening in terms of refugees coming to America is, of course, enormously important to people. But something that's happening across the sea is not something upon which people tend to vote. And I tend to believe that that's a mistake, and that they're, like with the United Nations Association, with others, and certainly we see the level of activism that's arisen across the United States. I think a lot of the reason that people are out there is because they want America to represent its best values, and we want to restore that leadership. And I think that really suggests that the no air raid here, right? Okay. Anyway, that really suggests that these issues need to be talked about. People should organize around them, and they should be part of platforms that in state conventions. That the United States needs to be engaged in these issues, and candidates who are running. And this is a tough issue because of the strong support of the United States for Israel, et cetera. But I think clearly they need to be asked, don't we belong in there? Aren't you going to press to get us back in there? And certainly if there's a change of administration, shouldn't we be running again and engaging? and certainly everyone that saw what we were able to do. We were on the Human Rights Council for 6 years, took a year off. Even as an observer, we're quite active because the rules say you can only serve 6 years at a time. Then we were reelected in December of 2016, and the Russians were defeated. I mean, what a great victory, for the kind of values that we were representing. And then we're in the middle of a 3-year term and we walk off. But clearly, we need to be back in there. And certainly by the time we have another administration, we need to be. But the support for that and the principled support by the American people for it needs to be something that people speak out on and press candidates on and bring to the forefront in terms of the issues that we want from people that we vote for. Okay.
Unfortunately, I don't think we have time for more questions. We are trying to keep on schedule because we've got another panel after this one. But I very much want to thank Ambassador Rapp for his insights and for bringing his experience to bear on this issue. Please join me in thanking him. And now, if I might invite the first panel to join me here on the stage. We'll get started in just 1 minute.
I did. Yeah, it's me.
Yes, I'm actually going to use this. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started. We'll now turn to our first panel. You have in your materials their biographical statements, so I will give them only a very brief introduction for the benefit of those who are viewing this session. First off, joining us by Skype is David Crane, who I hope you can see on the screen. David, can you hear me? Excellent. David was to have been here with us this morning. He could not catch his flight, and he's kindly agreed to join us electronically, and we're going to start with him. David is principal of Justice Consultancy International, LLC, and is former chief prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone. David will speak from the perspective of an international prosecutor about the investigation and documentation that are necessary to build a case for the eventual prosecution of international crimes such as those allegedly taking place in Yemen today. Following David will be Safa Abdulsalam Kherman, a Yemeni investigative journalist who will offer a brief overview of the history of the conflict from the perspective of a journalist, a lawyer, and a citizen of Yemen. Amanda Catanzano is Senior Director for International Programs, Policy, and Advocacy at the International Rescue Committee. She will speak from the perspective of an operational agency seeking to address the humanitarian crisis on the ground. And finally, we will hear from Kate Kaiser, the Policy Director of Win Without War. Kate will talk about the role of international arms sales in fueling the conflict and the prospects for enlisting Western governments in support of diplomatic and legal remedies. We've asked each panelist to speak for no more than 10 to 12 minutes, which, if all goes well, will leave about 15 to 20 minutes for your questions. And David, it's going to be hard for me to keep you on schedule because you won't see my little 2-minute warning signs. But please join us now, and thanks again for making the effort to be with us this morning.
Thank you, Mark, and well, good morning. My sincere apologies. It's tough to get a late phone call. I wish they'd call a little earlier. saying that all of your flights are canceled and have been moved. And I would have been speaking to you around 5 o'clock this afternoon if it all goes the way Delta had it planned. So I'm glad the technology allows me to address you on this very, very important morning or afternoon. To my distinguished panelists, I apologize for not being with you. I look forward to hearing your remarks. I do want to thank the sponsors, good friends from the American Society for International Law. Mark, thank you for that introduction. I didn't hear it. I hope it was okay. I deny everything that deals with any kind of criminal activity. Stimson Center, again, always a great place to hold a great conference such as this. And of course, I really want to note my good friend Rodney Dixon, Queen's Counsel, who reached out to me and asked if I could be a part of this. And Stephen, thank you for setting this up. A great tee-up. Stephen and I go way back. We're comrades in arms, so to speak, and really his perspectives are incredibly important. I'm going to talk to you briefly this morning on 3 parts. I'm going to set the context of the tragedy in Yemen. Talk a little bit about Yemen, but we're all going to talk about Yemen for the rest of the day. And then just some considerations from a practitioner who's been doing this for 20 years related to investigations and future prosecutions. I think it'll be helpful in your discussions later on. You know, we're living in an age of extremes. I never thought when that wall came down, and being an old Cold Warrior facing the evil empire for most of my career, I never thought we would be in 2018 in the place that we are. We're seeing a retraction from the concept of international cooperation. Much to my surprise, we have a rise of nationalism not seen since the late 20s and early 1930s. A very scary proposition indeed. And then, of course, with that comes this growing and deepening skepticism of international regimes and norms. I think it's important that we understand these contexts when we're thinking about Yemen. Of course, we're also seeing the increase in what I call the dirty little wars. Not to demean the fact that they're little, they're not little in a contextual way, but they're dirty little wars in the sense that no one's following international humanitarian law. Parties go at it tooth and nail. And it's been my experience around the world in Syria, Sierra Leone, and Sri Lanka. The main victims, as always, are civilians, and even increasingly so, and particularly women and children. You know, modern international criminal law has evolved as a critical accountability paradigm. You know, over 25 years, we've got the experience. We have the jurisprudence and the rules of evidence and procedure to face down this beast of impunity, despite this age of extremes that we are in. Yet it continues to be under scrutiny, modern international criminal law. And having been and have served in the federal government for over 30 years, you know, really the United States, let's be honest, is increasingly no longer a significant voice in either modern international criminal law or just in international rule of law issues anymore. And that is a dangerous and really an unknown future. We never expected the U.S. to be on the outside. And having been a Cold Warrior, the bad guy used to be the Soviet Union. The bad guy now is the United States of America. Let's shift gears, and my second point, and just talk a little bit about Yemen. Yemen is one of those dirty little wars. It's a war of proxy. Players are maneuvering and manipulating and backing and aiding and abetting international crimes. Of course, as I stated in my initial remarks, civilians are the overwhelming victims in all of this. The parties that are involved are obviously those who are backing the various parties to the conflict, but we have a murky, shadowy set of supporters in the background, which Steve talked about, and I think one of the questions chatted about this, and that is countries who aid and abet or come close to aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity on all sides. And of course, the United States, United Kingdom, and others are making billions of dollars in assisting Saudi Arabia in perpetrating this conflict. And that needs to be, this area of the law needs to continue to be expanded so that we can hold accountability countries who knowingly provide arms to individuals who are waging conflict resulting in international crimes. With all that being said, I'm going to now address some of the challenges related to just dealing with these situations where we see international crimes and local and domestic crimes being committed related to atrocity law. You know, Yemen doesn't have, and not quite yet, and I certainly will talk about this in a minute, but we don't have, as Steve alluded to, and that is some type of professional gathering mechanism by people who actually have investigated atrocities and prosecuted atrocities. Similar to the Triple IM for Syria, which was an area that I dealt with and was my original idea back in August of 2016, born out of frustration as head of the Syrian Accountability Project, that really nothing was being done. Sat down with a group of ambassadors at the UN, and we see a couple months later the Triple IM created. And I think it is a good beta test for these kind of situations, because it's been my experience that atrocities continue to travel at a faster rate than the international community has the ability to investigate and preserve evidence. So what needs to be done? Well, this morning I am announcing, similar to the Syrian Accountability Project, that we are creating the Yemeni Accountability Project, doing the various same things that the Syrian Accountability Project has been doing, and that is conflict map, crime-based matrix, major incident index, as well as drafting neutrally indictments against all parties and creating white papers related to issues that stem from the conflict. We've been doing with the Syrian Accountability Project since March of 2011, one of the oldest international NGOs to do such, and we'll continue to do that work for Syria. One of the things that we need to note is that when Steve and I were back in Africa investigating atrocities, you know, we did it kind of the old-fashioned way. We didn't have the clutter of social media. And I call it clutter because in reality, social media is really complicating the professional investigations of atrocity. That's now we're getting to the point where we're in the petabyte amount of data coming out of Syria, and none of it is useful in court. There's no foundation, there's no relevancy. We can't even prove who took the picture, et cetera, et cetera. So it gives us a false sense that we are building an incredibly strong case against all of the parties in Syria or eventually in Yemen. And in reality, we have very little evidence that can go into court and prove cases. Caesar report, which I am a co-author of, is one of the few instances where we have direct, specific evidence that is provable as evidence in court to show that Assad and his henchmen are committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. But there is very little evidence that can really move us forward into an appropriate local, regional, or international prosecution. So I caution that. Back when I was investigating and drafting indictments against the individuals who were eventually convicted in the special court for Sierra Leone, which Steve had also had an important part in, we didn't have this. And we went out the old-fashioned way and investigated these things. And I think that we just have to caution ourselves. And I cautioned the diplomats in the United States assumptions on false premises, and hence we developed the Triple IM. Well, again, proper methods to account for these atrocities. You have to have a conflict map, a narrative of the crimes being committed in an atrocity zone. Also, it's very, very important that you build a verifiable crime-based matrix, which allows a future local, regional, or international prosecutor to be able to develop investigations and begin to considering draft indictments. Another thing that you need to do, and again, this is something where you start broadly with a conflict map, you begin to work on your crime-based matrix, but then you have your analysts go through, your criminal analysts go through and develop what we call a major incident index, where we highlight the most egregious of the crimes. You can't prosecute all crimes and seek justice for all victims. So you have to pick out those particular crimes that represent an international or domestic crime like rape, maiming, mutilation, pillage, plunder, whatever the particular crime is. And that's what we did effectively in West Africa. So it's very, very important that you have that, because from the major incident index, which calls out of, like in the Syrian Accountability Project, 9,000 pages of verified incidents that have taken place since March of 2011, allows a future prosecutor and, of course, the director of IIIM to sit there and look at those incidents in index and actually build a case against those who perpetrate these crimes, and from that draft indictments. Now, the indictments, of course, are the type that I'm looking at and the type that are drafted back when I drafted the indictments against the individuals who perpetrated those atrocities in West Africa. Our indictments were essentially 20, 25 pages long. We used representational charging. In other words, crimes that represent particular international crimes. We also did something for the first time in history, a thing called notice pleading. Something I learned as a federal prosecutor in the United States is, really, we don't have to have massive amounts of putting your evidence in the indictments like in Yugoslavia and Rwanda, where those were horrifically long. I learned when I was in law school that the more you write, the more you plead, the more you have to prove. So the indictments are very, very specific. And so the standard really is that the potential indictee has to understand the crimes that they have committed and their involvement in it. And so we drafted notice pleading indictments, and they have withstood legal scrutiny, and I think that they should continue to be the standard by which we hold individuals accountable. I could go on all day on all of this using very specific practice vignettes, but I just want to conclude at the end of the day, despite all of our discussions, despite all of our considerations, despite all of our indictments, investigations, and the diplomatic and political dust that's in the air, this is all about the victims. It's all about the victims. I reminded my people all the time in West Africa that it's all about the victims. And if you lose that focus, then we lose our ability to, in fact, seek justice. So I just want to highlight that to you. We need to develop concrete, practical ways by which we can seek justice for the people of Yemen. I'll just give you one vignette. I can give you all kinds of war stories, but I'll just give you one vignette. And I was in one of my outreach programs, which we started back in West Africa and Sierra Leone, and I walked that countryside for 3 full years. And I was in McKinney, the former headquarters of the RUF, the Revolutionary United Front, the individuals who gutted, chopped, and did incredible maiming of the populace within Sierra Leone. And I was just talking to a group of victims. And I used to stand right among them, listening to them. And no more than 12 feet from me, a boy of about 12, I was told, stood up, and he had been deafened during the combat. And in the atonal voice of someone like that said, "I killed people. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it." And he fell into my arms, weeping. As I was holding him, tears in my eyes, I looked up, and there was a young woman who was standing not that far from me as well. She was missing a great portion of her face. It had been forced into a pot of boiling water. She was holding her child, and through one good eye and cracked lips, she just said in Creole, "Seek justice for us." So with that, I will again thank you for listening to me and the time that you allowed me, and I compliment the organizers as well as all of you, and hopefully we can have a robust discussion on seeking justice for the people of Yemen. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. And now we turn to Safa.
Oh, that was quick. Thank you. I'm going to try to stick to the 12 minutes, but she generously offered me 3 minutes. So. I'm going to talk about 3 main points. The first one would be a quick background, if I can do that, and then Is it no? Yeah. Good, okay. So I'm going to talk about three main points. The first will be a background, and then a quick brief about violations and the remarks on accountability and reparations. There are two aspects to the Yemeni conflict, a local aspect or perspective and a regional and international perspective. The Yemeni conflict at its core is a local conflict that has been historically and currently usually that drives international and regional powers for the interest groups to fulfill their interests and goals. We have been talking now, like listening to the other speakers, we talk about the legal aspect of the conflict, the political aspect of the conflict, the military aspect of the conflict. But what is missing in the international narrative is the racial aspect of the conflict. The Houthis as a group is a supremacist group that believes in their divine entitlement to rule the people as descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And this entitlement grants them political, economic, social, and even intellectual privileges. So they say that usually for every conflict or struggle in communities, there is an original sin. So for example, in the US, the original sin is slavery. In South Africa, is the apartheid. In Europe, it's colonization. In the Israeli-Arab conflict, it's the occupation, and we can go on and on. And the original sin of the Yemeni conflict, as far as I'm concerned, is what I would call Hashemi supremacy. And Hashemi supremacy dates back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and every time throughout the Islamic history, it emerges from time to time with this idea of the divine entitlement to rule the people based on the bloodline to the Prophet. So if there is one sentence to sum up the conflict in Yemen, it would be the reproduction of the history of the country before 1962. Before 1962, there were two Yemens, the north, under the control of the Imamate, who are Hashemis, descendants of the Prophet, and who believed in this idea. So for more than 1,000 years, they ruled the country exclusively as descendants. And then you have the south with its strategic ports and islands, and it was under the authority of international powers, mainly Britain. Aden was a British colony, and the rest was like left to the local governance. Now, 56 years forward, what you see, the repetition of the history in the north, the Houthis, who believe in the Imamate, are in control of the north, and then in the south, you see Emirates is in control of the strategic ports and islands in the south. So that was the historical background. The current background, I'm going to quickly go through 5 main stages, and at each stage, the best way for me to explain usually to my friends or professors or anyone is that at each stage there was a mistake that led to a crime. So the first stage is the 2011 revolution. Prior to the revolution, the regime of late President Ali Abdullah Saleh, he was very corrupt. He ruled the country for 33 years, leading it to be the poorest country in the region. There was 6 wars against the Houthis in the north, who had at the time legitimate grievances. Like they were oppressed as a minority, six wars. And then the south wanted to secede because the north, after the unification in 1990, Ali Abdullah Saleh considered the southern state, because it was a socialist state, they considered the lands as a booty, and then they confiscated all the lands. They dismantled the army. So later that led to calls for separation. But the main trigger, in my opinion, was Ali Abdullah Saleh's plan to make his son Ahmed his successor for the presidency, and then making Yemen a semi-monarchy. The mistake at this stage, in my opinion, was the revolutionaries' incapability to form a political party to safeguard the revolution and protect the outcomes of the revolution. What happened, the crime, if I can call it that resulted from this, was that the old interest groups and stakeholders, whether regional or local, were the ones who dictated the terms of the negotiations and enforced immunity to gave Ali Abdullah Saleh full immunity in exchange of his removal from not power, from presidency, because technically he held all power. According to this, Ali Abdullah Saleh was allowed to practice politics. He had all access to power, financial resources, the army. Then he made alliance with the Houthis, and this is the crime that resulted from the mistake of not forming a political party. The second stage is the transitional period, which started with the National Dialogue Conference mid-2013. At this stage, Yemen, believe it or not, Yemen was put at the same level with Tunisia as the two best examples of the Arab Spring countries that could come out of this revolution and bring a successful example. But what happened at this stage is, while all political parties, including the Houthis and the southern separatist movement, while they were negotiating politically the future of Yemen and the social contract of Yemen and the new shape of the state, the Houthi militias in alliance with Ali Abdullah Saleh were marching militarily from the north towards the capital, while the international community, the UN and the Gulf Corporate Council, who were supervising the National Dialogue Conference, they did not consider them as a military and non-state supremacist armed group. They would continue identifying them as a political group. And one of the things that I really remembered when I was covering the news with Al Jazeera is Jamal bin Umar during the fighting in Amran. When he used to describe it, he would say, the conflict in Amran between different armed groups, and I don't know the legal of this terminology, while it was between the state and its representing military factions in Amran and a non-state military armed group. But Jamal bin Umar would say between armed groups. So this crime of neglecting what is a non-state supremacist armed group is doing on the ground, this mistake has led to the crime of the full collapse of the political process in Yemen. Because the National Dialogue Conference has ended, there were outcomes, a draft of constitution was supposed to be put to referendum, but the Houthis kept marching towards the capital. They took the government, and the political process collapsed. Then comes the Saudi-led intervention, which happened 5 months after the Houthis takeover of the capital, which indicates that Saudi Arabia, the regional powers, the international powers, did not mind the Houthis taking, or a non-state armed group taking the state, but what they minded and did not accept is them crossing the red line of Aden and reaching the strategic city of Aden. And in here I want to mention a very important interview. Anwar Ishqi, he is a former Saudi general. I think 1 month after the intervention, he was in a TV interview, and he said the Houthis promised the United States to counter terrorism, mainly Al-Qaeda. And they promised one of the coalition countries to fight. He was referring to Emirates and fighting the Muslim Brotherhood, because Emirates does not like the Muslim Brotherhood. They have a strong political position against them. And they promised Saudi Arabia to give up their coordination with Iran, and they will coordinate with Saudi Arabia. But he continues saying, the Houthis fooled everyone. And they took the money, they did not comply. And this means, again, that what the United States and the international community cares about Yemen is only countering terrorism. Other than that, the collapse of state, the security of the region, the lives of the civilians, it does not matter to them. And then Emirates, they have their own agenda, and then Saudi Arabia, all that it cares about is keeping Yemen a weak, vulnerable state, because for Yemen to succeed as a republic country with a democratic system and like built on principles of the rule of law and constitutionalism, that would pose an existential threat to the monarchy hub Yemen is set in. Now, to the violations of international law and human rights. There are violations committed by all parties, like all parties share these violations. The first one is restrictions on humanitarian access. Saudi-led coalition, I would actually prefer to call it Saudi-Emirati-led coalition because both of them are leading it, which restricts entry, and then the Houthis who restrict distribution. And then you have arbitrary detention, you have indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks on civilians. The Houthis are exclusively, allegedly committing these crimes. First one is not allegedly, it's a fact, the coup itself, which is a crime under the domestic law. And then use of child soldiers and mines, land mines and sea mines. There are estimates of hundreds of thousands of mines. There are no maps, and it's going to take Yemen like years and years to remove them and dismantle them. Now, the violations by the coalition, and here it gets tricky because it's hard to draw the line between the political and the legal. And first, the use of prohibited arms, and the second one is the divergence of their missions. So when the spokesman of the coalition announced the reason and the aims of and the justification for the coalition, there were 3 points: 1, to push the Houthis back; 2, to restore the legitimacy of the president; and 3, to protect the Yemeni civilians. 1, they have not, like, honestly and directly pushed the Houthis back from the territories they control. They're only interested in the cities that have geopolitical interests for their own agendas. Like the south, within 2 months, they cleaned it from the Houthis. They took Aden, Socotra, and the strategic areas. And then the last one is the protection of the civilians. Now, Yemen is the worst humanitarian crisis, and this is not a byproduct of the conflict. This is actually a product as a conduct of hostility. All parties are using it to... Am I done? 1 minute? Okay. Accountability. As a person who has just graduated from Harvard Law School, one of the biggest questions that I couldn't find an answer to is how do we categorize the Yemeni conflict? Is it an IAC, which is an international armed conflict, or an IAC, an international armed conflict? On December 7th, 2017, after the Houthis fired the missiles into Saudi Arabia, the spokesman of the coalition made a statement saying that Saudi Arabia will respond under their inherent right to self-defense. Does this trigger the international armed conflict categorization of the conflict? Because if we are going to consider it as an IAC, international armed conflict, then this means that it would open the doors for us to consider Emirates as an occupying power or not. So I don't know, the categorization, which then would allow us to choose what law applies to hold people accountable, and then the reparation is a totally different thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, is it Amanda who's going next? Okay.
Good morning, thank you, and thank you to the organizers for having us all and for having such a strong female representation on the panel, which doesn't always happen, particularly on these issues. So I wanted to recognize that and appreciate being part of this discussion. I'm here as a representative of the International Rescue Committee. The International Rescue Committee is a independent humanitarian organization that seeks to assist and rebuild the lives of those who've been affected by disaster and crisis. We're operational in about 40 countries around the world, including inside of Yemen. So I think that this part of the conversation will shift gears a little bit to focus really narrowly on the humanitarian impact of the crisis, and to also look at the aspects of international humanitarian law violations that don't get as much airtime as civilian casualties and airstrikes, but are no less significant, or arguably more significant, on the civilian population when we talk about the deprivation of humanitarian assistance and commercial imports. And so I think that's what I'm going to focus on mostly, which is just to give you a sense of the perspective from which I'm speaking. The IRC has been in Yemen for 6 years. Since 2012, we began delivering life-saving services in the south, providing clean water and emergency aid to villages in the south. When the conflict intensified in March of 2015, we made a decision in May of 2015 to evacuate. It was a very short-lived decision. We were back a month later, and we've been there ever since. But we've expanded our presence. We're both in the south and the north, in 7 governorates in 29 districts throughout the country, including, if you could all hold close to your hearts, our 40 staff of Yemeni staff that are in Hodeida right now. We have a staff of about 400. We're one of the largest health and wash providers in the country. Most of that staff, about 380 of that staff, are Yemeni nationals. It's a very small expat community. We rely on the expertise and the humanitarian nature of Yemenis to serve in their own communities. So we've reached about 3 million Yemenis in these 7 governorates over the last 6 years, and we deliver essential medicines and supplies to hospitals. We provide nutrition and health support through mobile health teams that can access some of the most rural parts of Yemen, as well as augmenting static facilities within Yemen itself. And we work on food aid and emergency livelihoods as well, and we also operate women's and children protection and empowerment centers in the north and the south. We also, in addition to direct programming, we provide services through partnerships with local NGOs. So not only to serve and help those in need, but also to build the capacity of Yemeni NGOs to do this in their own communities. So we wanted to provide a background for who we are and what we do, and to give a voice to those who we serve, because as David Crane mentioned, when you lose sight of the victims, I think you lose sight of justice. When you lose sight of the victims, you lose sight of what a humanitarian crisis truly is, and you focus on the overwhelmingly depressing statistics rather than the individuals that we deal with every day in Yemen. I won't paint the picture of the humanitarian crisis. This is a well-informed room. You've heard all of those numbers, and so I won't bore you with them. But I think we've talked a lot about why has this crisis kind of unraveled the way it has, and I think we all know that Yemen was in humanitarian crisis before this conflict began, but the bottom has really fallen out in the last 3 years. And we've talked a lot already about the violence and how Yemen has really symbolized some of the darkest aspects of modern warfare, and whether that's siege, whether that's attacks without distinction and proportionality. There's a lot of people much smarter on that in this room than I am, so I'm going to let them take the lead on that part of the conversation. And I'm going to focus rather on the access challenges, the humanitarian access challenges, which are another form of IHL violations that are equally against international law, and arguably have had more of an impact on the civilian population. We've done a lot of research in Yemen that proves that while attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure are of course devastating, many more Yemenis have died and continue to suffer as a result of the deprivation of humanitarian access and commercial access, rather than as a result of the actual conduct of war. Not to underestimate or wish away the conduct of war, but just to take a look at some of the other aspects. I think that the Saudi and Emirati-led coalition's naval and air blockade really came into sort of the public consciousness, and by public I mean people like who are in this room, maybe not necessarily the true public's consciousness, in November, when in response to ballistic missile attack into Saudi Arabia, there was a complete shutdown of the air and seaports going into Yemen on November 6th of 2017. And while that was a relatively draconian measure, I think it's important to understand the nuance of there was a pretty big stranglehold on imports into the country long before November 6th, and this was just an extremely non-subtle version of a stranglehold that already existed. So it's this blockade has disproportionately restricted the flow of food and fuel and medicine since 2015, since the passage of the UN resolution that put the arms embargo in place and allowed for inspections as sort of a fig leaf to slow that down. But there has also been, I think, a disproportionate amount of talk in this conversation and probably throughout this day on the Saudi-led coalition's role in this. And I also want to make sure that we understand that all parties to this conflict have slowed down access to humanitarian. I think one way, and I think our Amnesty colleagues have done this well in their latest report. To simplify it is to say that the Saudi-led coalition has made it very difficult to get humanitarian and commercial imports into Yemen. The de facto Houthi authorities have made it very difficult to move those goods and deliver services within Yemen. So I think it's a useful way of thinking about it. The Saudis and the Emiratis have made it difficult for us to get what we need into the country to deliver to those in need. The Houthi authorities in the areas where they control have made it very difficult to do our jobs in those areas. You could argue about where the more impactful bureaucratic impediments are, but they exist on all sides. And as a not neutral, impartial humanitarian, I want to make that very clear. So what do these humanitarian access challenges look like? And I want to kind of make really pointed examples of what these look like. I mean, every day, long before November 6th, our staff have to navigate a really Byzantine set of inspections and impediments to assist communities in need. So to give you an example, we have had so much trouble importing into Hodeidah as the IRC over the last 3 years that we have made an organizational decision to try to use Aden, and we can discuss until the cows come home why Aden is not a full and complete substitute for Hodeidah. It's not. But we as an organization have made the decision to use Aden because of the slowdowns at Hodeidah. But on the flip side, 70% of the people who are in need live in Houthi-controlled areas that are far from Aden, which means that we have to travel sometimes a distance of hundreds of miles. We need to pass through up to 70 checkpoints between the port of Aden to get to Sana'a. That's a checkpoint every 4.3 miles, just to put a fine point on it. As we try to traverse the country, we are stopped every 4.3 miles. It takes IRC teams 3 to 6 weeks of planning and permitting to get one truck from Aden to Sana'a. These are time-stamp permits. If you run into a roadblock anywhere, you're starting from scratch again to get things where they need to go. And so that's a kind of a window into what it's like to move things around. When you're talking about getting things into the country, they're also subject to infuriating and unnecessary delays. I think you'll hear more today about the duplication of the UNVIM inspection mechanisms. The Saudis have a second inspection mechanism that they put in place that causes, in some cases up to month-long delays for clearance, and sometimes that can be waiting up to 10 days after they've been cleared through UNVIM. We also, as humanitarians, to get in and out of the country, we rely on UN humanitarian air service. There's no other way for us to get in and out, with the exception of a boat that goes from Djibouti into the port of Aden. But the Saudi-led coalition issues clearances for these flights within hours before departure, and there's high incidences of sudden cancellations. This is between the port delays and these air flight problems that we have. We have international medical suppliers who will no longer undertake delivery straight into Yemen. And as I mentioned when I was outlining IRC's role in Yemen, we're a major medical and health service delivery, but also in terms of supplies to hospitals. Most of these medical suppliers will no longer deliver straight to Yemen. So while we've seen I think it cost us previously about $5,000 to get one container's worth of medical supplies into Yemen. Now that these medical suppliers have started to refuse to travel to Yemen directly, and we have to offload in Djibouti or offload in Jazan, we are going from $5,000 to about $12,000 for the same amount of medical supplies. So it's time and it's money that eats away at the funding. We could talk all day about the steady decline in food and fuel imports and what that's meant. But I think that we can say with some confidence it's meant nothing less than almost a total collapse of the economy. There's a lot of reasons why the economy has collapsed, and you may wonder as a humanitarian, why am I concerned about the economics? But because humanitarians cannot meet all the needs of 27 million Yemenis, there needs to be commercial imports, there needs to be commercial activities, and we've seen a collapse in that, and we've seen it because of the low number in imports of food, but particularly the low numbers in the imports of fuel. Fuel has an impact on us as humanitarians. It means our mobile health teams can't get out at the same rate they were because it's too expensive to move them around. It means our staff has to make decisions about bus fare or food for their families, so they some days make decisions not to go to work for that reason. Fuel has secondary knock-on effects that affect if you have a shortage of fuel, then you have medical facilities that cannot work and serve patients. You have water and sanitation facilities that cannot run, and therefore there's a lack of drinking water that is clean for our clients. And so I think that it's important to see both the immediate impacts, but then there's also the inflationary impacts of fuel. It makes food more expensive. There's food in every store. I see from my colleagues in the field daily pictures of shelves full of food in areas that are on the brink of famine because the rial has devalued so much that people cannot afford. They've lost their jobs. They've lost all resiliency. So there's these knock-on effects that happen from a restriction of access that isn't just about the humanitarian response, but it's about the overall quality of living. It's about the overall economy. And I think that often gets lost in the discussions around airstrikes. It often gets lost around. But I think another thing that gets lost in the discussions around is the lack of, it's not just the economic collapse itself, but it's the lack of service delivery that comes with that. So you have humanitarians, like I said, trying to replicate the services of a state, whether that's delivering medicine, whether that's delivering sanitation. You have civil servants who haven't been paid since August of 2016. It's another example of a complete collapse of the economy. And so I will wrap up. I could give you statistics till the cows came home again on what the impact of these fuel and food shortages have been. But I just wanted to paint a picture that the international humanitarian law violations in Yemen go beyond sort of the catastrophic airstrikes that do make the news, and not to minimize the impact in the loss for those families and those communities, but to also stress the knock-on effects of civilian infrastructure. And so even an airstrike where no one's killed, if it knocks a water sanitation plant offline, if it knocks a hospital offline, and these airstrikes have knocked about 50% of the hospitals in Yemen offline, these have effects on communities that last long past the day of the actual strike itself. And so as this conversation continues and is focused a lot on the kinetic action, I would urge us all to keep in mind the knock-on effects of that kinetic action long after that day, and to keep in mind it is still against international humanitarian law to deny access to humanitarian aid, and it's the responsibility of all parties to make sure that unfettered access for humanitarian actors and freedom of movement exists. And I cannot think in all of the 40 countries where my organization operates a place where we are more constrained. South Sudan may be a distant second, but there's no place where we are more constrained by all parties than we are in Yemen. So thank you for your time, and thank you for a little sliver of the day on access and humanitarian challenges in addition to the impact of kinetic action.
Thank you very much. And now we turn to Kate.
Thanks. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to be on this distinguished panel with so many women. So I'm going to talk about the international role in this conflict, as well as prospects for a political solution. I think we're in a very unique time with the Hodeidah offensive being talked about and potentially being launched if Martin Griffiths fails to get his Hail Mary pass and get the coalition to agree to his plan for Hodeidah. To start off with, for over 3 years at this point, the US, UK, and France have all been actively fueling this conflict by aiding the coalition through political and military means. So the aspects of that support vary by country. But there's two bigger buckets. There's the political support that gives cover for the coalition's actions in the international community. And then there's the military support that actually allows the conflict to continue indefinitely, essentially. So the U.S. has been providing mid-air refueling, intelligence for targeting purposes, as well as other logistical support, including U.S. personnel in the Joint Air Ops Center that's in Riyadh, or in Saudi Arabia. And the UK, as well as arms sales, you can never forget those, which is only increased under this current administration. The UK has been also selling arms to Saudi Arabia and the UAE throughout this conflict, as well as providing other targeting assistance. They're much more in the weeds on the targeting aspects, but it's to a lesser extent than the United States. And then France has also been providing military support in terms of arms sales, in terms of potentially some logistical support for the Hodeidah offensive. There's been talk about providing demining sweepers to address the mines that Saifa was talking about. And, you know, every time there's an airstrike that kills civilians or hits a hospital or, as recently as last week, hits a cholera center of an international operational NGO, there's a reaction in these countries that, okay, that's just another bad instance, but it was a mistake, it wasn't intentional, and we just kind of continue on business as normal. And how that has played out in the international stage is that these three countries also providing political cover for the Emiratis and Saudi Arabia to prevent a full-blown commission of inquiry into atrocities by all sides in the conflict last fall. It was actually the US and the UK and others who prevented kind of a clean version of that commission from coming to fruition in the UN Human Rights Council. And that had been attempted for years previously, and it had been the US and UK who had prevented that from moving forward in that forum. And so we see this play out, especially in terms of political negotiations, because the irony in all of this, in terms of fueling the conflict, they also call for a political solution to the conflict, but there's no real action to actually foment a real negotiation that would move forward to a transition and figuring out what the future of Yemen looks like. So in terms of the support, the real effect, besides, allowing to the coalition to continue sorties at the tempo in which they are conducting airstrikes, it also gives them a sense that they can continue indefinitely this war, and that support will always be unconditional. Particularly under the Trump administration, he has really green-lit this idea, especially from the Saudis and Emiratis, that anything they do in Yemen really is not bad enough that we will ever cut off arms sales, that we will ever consider cutting off military support, because this administration and more throughout the international community is starting to view Yemen through an Iran-only lens. And what that has done, particularly in Washington, is blinded the administration as well as policymakers for really seeing what the roots of this conflict is, seeing the pathways for a future negotiated settlement and what that looks like, and actively engaging in that process and being supportive and holding its partners accountable. Whether that is getting battle damage reports from U.S.-fueled sorties that are flying over Yemen and conducting airstrikes that kill civilians. There is a lot of different things that the U.S. does not get in terms of transparency, in terms of report backs from the coalition, accountability just between those two partners that allows them to continue to have the same behavior for the past 3 years that have now been called the leading cause of civilian casualties in the conflict. There is an obligation under international law, as well as U.S. law, to basically ensure that whoever you are selling weapons to or giving assistance to in a security arena, that they are not misusing that assistance. Now, when you bring violations of the laws of war or evidence of, an indiscriminate airstrike to the U.S., and I'm speaking a lot about the U.S. because I work in U.S. policy, and there are a lot of other people in this room who work on UK and France. But when you bring them this evidence of violations, there's always this idea that, well, it wasn't intentional. We can't do anything. They didn't mean to do it. They're just not up to capacity. There's a bunch of different excuses that are given, when really the law is very clear. If you are using U.S. weapons not the way they are supposed to be used, that assistance is supposed to be cut off. If you're a country who's receiving U.S. security assistance, whether in the form of weapon sales, refueling, other support, and they are blocking humanitarian assistance delivery, as the Saudis and Emiratis are. All U.S. assistance, whether security or economic or otherwise, should also be cut off according to the law. Now, essentially, the Obama and Trump administrations have largely ignored our own laws as well as international law and continuing to fuel this conflict. And that is really kind of what brings me to the irony of, the international assessments that come out from the UNSC panel of experts that say, the fact that they are using what's called a precision-guided munition or a smart bomb, which the U.S. sells to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates to hit civilian objects and kill civilians, that means that they are intentionally doing that. And in the meantime, the UK, US, and France continue to rely on these quote-unquote assurances from the coalition that really are like verbal commitments to improve procedure, not hit civilians, and that's how the precision-guided munition sale that there was a fight in the Senate over last June ended up being released, because US policymakers are essentially relying on Saudi and Emirati lip service in order to guarantee the correct use of these weapons. And yet we've continued to see, since those commitments were made last June by former Foreign Minister Jubair in Saudi Arabia, that none of those protections or procedural improvements have actually had an impact on the ground. We've seen just as high a tempo, if not higher a tempo, of airstrikes on civilian objects and civilian areas, as well as Amanda noted, the increase in the blockade that had been ongoing since 2015, but really hit a fever pitch last November. And the result of that full blockade in just a few weeks last November caused a 24% increase of those on the brink of famine. So this has a real human cost. But it's kind of it goes over the head of a lot of people who are dealing with this conflict because it's a big statistic, or our combating Iran is a bigger priority when actually, like, the war, the way it's being conducted, is undermining those interests anyways. So in terms of the negotiations, I think there's, over the last few years, there was a lot of not wide support, I think, for the special envoy, who's seen as biased by both sides. And now we have a new UN special envoy, Martin Griffiths, who's come into office, and the international community has really rallied around him. In terms of kind of putting all their eggs in one basket, if we just support Griffiths' plan, then this will all be solved. We don't have to change anything. We don't have to change our policies. We just need to support the special envoy. And that's really important. It's absolutely very important. But the problem is that because the US and UK and France are continuing the same policies, they are making a big risk that if Griffiths cannot get the coalition and President Hadi, who are key spoilers still to any future negotiations moving forward, that we're just going to, again, have this war continue indefinitely, because there's no real cost-benefit analysis from the suppliers of this war, essentially, to determine whether or not we should actually change what we're doing, because nothing is getting better. Everyone always says, let's wait and see, let's wait and give them smarter bombs, give them more assistance, things will get better, but that doesn't ever happen. So, especially in the context of Hodeidah, as I believe Stephen mentioned, the coalition has launched the offensive in terms of being south of the city. They've claimed to have taken the airport. Both sides claim they control the airport, so that's TBD. But they haven't launched the full-scale offensive on the city itself, and that is where you get into siege situations, where you get to street-by-street warfare, as well as creating a front line around the port that will essentially serve as a blockade. So they can say we're not attacking the port, but the second-order effects of launching an offensive on the city will have that same effect. And so what Griffiths is trying to do right now is he secured agreement from the Houthis to allow UN oversight of the port, to redirect all port revenues to the Central Bank of Yemen, which the Hadi government controls in the south in Aden. And this actually mirrors very closely, a deal put forth by the previous special envoy last year that the coalition and Hadi government at the time energetically accepted and were excited to move forward with it, but they couldn't get the Houthis on board because the incentive structure at the time were not the right balance. And now we have a situation where Griffiths has gotten the Houthi to agree, and yet now the coalition, and particularly the Emiratis, are moving the goalposts, essentially saying now we'll only accept unconditional withdrawal of Houthi forces from Hodeidah city as well as the port, which mirrors the UN Security Council Resolution 2216 that was passed in March 2015 to essentially justify the intervention in the first place. And President Hadi has used to spoil negotiations by using it as a precondition to even start talking. And so really, if the US, the UK, and France want to actually support negotiations, instead of just providing rhetorical support to the special envoy, they need to actually have accountability for the leverage that they have and exercise that leverage. That could look like cutting off arms sales until they actually accept negotiations. That could actually just be as simple as specifically saying don't launch the assault publicly, which the U.S. in particular has still not done. It could be cutting off U.S. refueling support until they enter negotiations or don't launch an offensive on Hodeidah. There's a bunch of different tools, and that's why we started to see Congress have more votes on this and start to actually wake up to the situation that we are actively feeling a famine and massacre in the country. But until there's a change in behavior on the international side, there's a very big risk that Griffiths' efforts could run into the same problems that other special envoys have.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a remarkable panel, and I think we've all learned a lot. If people do have questions, I think we can take 2 or 3. Again, please keep your questions short, wait for the microphone, and please give your name and your affiliation. There's a question at the end.
Stanley Kober. It was said that the reason for these prosecutions is justice for the victims. But with Nuremberg, the idea was also deterrence of future crimes. And you're nodding. I don't see much deterrence. So what has happened to that?
Would you like to take that?
I'm nodding mostly because I agree with you. Not that I foresee it happening. I do think, full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer, but, the issue with negotiations, with accountability after negotiations, start and actually find a political settlement to the conflict, is that the international community needs to fully back that accountability. And because the US, UK, and France are all potentially complicit in these crimes and potentially could be held accountable, there's probably going to be a huge backlash from those countries to prevent any type of accountability. And to me, that's really, it's not only disheartening in terms of, the U.S. talks about itself as this like beacon of freedom and accountability and values and all these things when it doesn't actually act that way. But the second part of that is that the lack of accountability in the beginning of the political transition process during the revolution is what led us to where we are today. And so if there is no accountability for Yemen, we will likely see another conflict emerge in the future, in my opinion.
Another question? I think you had a question. It's anyone who hasn't asked a question? I'd like to get a new questioner unless there isn't one. Gentleman in the front, please. Right here.
Thank you. Abdurrahim Fuqara from Al Jazeera. One of the previous speakers said something about social media, in terms of social media being part of the problem, actually more than the solution when it comes to investigating war crimes. I wanted to get your take on them, especially people like you in the field. Do you feel that social media make it more complicated for you to do your work, or do you feel that they help? And if I may, I have one for Safat. She's the Arab on the panel. It is often said that people find it much easier to identify with people who look like them. In Yemen, we see Arabs doing thoroughly nasty things to other Arabs. And I just wanted to get your reaction in terms of Western reaction to what's happening in Yemen as opposed to Arab reactions to it, not in terms of governments and NGOs, but just in terms of gut feeling perception of the ordinary Arab. Thank you.
I can take that social media question first from the perspective, a field-based perspective. I mean, I think in our responses to many humanitarian crises, we've seen social media be a demon in some of the crises we've had to respond to. I think, the Rohingya crisis is an example of where social media fueled rumors and fueled riots and eventually a great deal of violence against the Rohingya population that caused them to flee to Bangladesh in such large numbers last year. And so I think this is an example of where social media can take something that may have just spread by word of mouth 20 or 30 years ago and spread those rumors really quickly. And I don't think we're immune to it here in our own political systems. So I don't think that's something that we can just vilify the Burmese for. I think it just took a particularly disturbing turn in that case. And I think in the case of Yemen and social media, when we do our jobs, I think there's a great responsibility that goes with information sharing. And I can give one example of where things went wrong with that last week. I mean, we want to be truth tellers. You can't do NGO advocacy. The whole point of doing NGO advocacy is that you are there on the ground and you are able to provide that information and give a voice to your clients. Very soon after the offensive launch last week, there was a rumor that the port had been declared a military zone and that all shipping had been at berthing had been stopped, and therefore no more imports were coming in. And people, for lack of a better term, freaked out very quickly because, understandably, as everyone in this room knows, the centrality of the Hodeidah port can't be overestimated. And that started to swirl on social media very quickly, even among very respected international NGOs, thankfully not the IRC. It wasn't true, and I think that folks who started to share that quickly, tried to say, okay, that was a rumor, that wasn't true. We're hearing now the WFP is berthing ships, but I think it undermines your credibility. There's a true fog of war that happens. People are looking out their door and trying to report on what they're seeing, but what you see isn't always reality. And so I think that we're under a lot of obligation as the voice of the people who are suffering in this crisis to be very judicious. In social media, you hit retweet really fast when you see something that fits your narrative. And I think the onus is on us as those representatives to make sure we don't do that. But that's another way, separate from accountability and separate from justice. It can get in the way of that when the voices on behalf of these issues become undermined by itchy social media trigger fingers.
Abdurrahim, your question is somehow, I think, more personal to an extent, like it triggers something inside me. But when it comes to the Western people, Yemen was usually known as the forgotten crisis. No thanks to Saudi Arabia, because it's like this big country, sensational country. When it intervened, it brought attention to what is happening in the country. So people usually, the ones I talk to who are a little bit familiar with the region, what they know about Yemen is before the war, terrorism, Al-Qaeda, and after the war, Saudi intervention. No one knows the nuances of the country, the local conflict. Most of the international media, I can claim, or let's say 60%, they date even the conflict with the Saudi intervention. The humanitarian crisis also brought attention to the suffering. When it comes to the Arabs, that is so hard to answer. Because I feel after the Arab Spring, what happened is that the humanitarian suffering has become a political matter, like even to the individuals. Like I would say, this is what has been happening. This party has committed this. They would say, that is because of the revolution. Why did you revolt against? So the sense of humanity, I feel, I'm not sure, this is like such a bold statement to make, is decreasing, I think, because of the political, I don't want to say sectarian in Yemen, it's not sectarian. To me, it's more racial than sectarian, which is very sad. But at the same time, we are all Middle Easterns, Arabs, and we share the same catastrophes, and our destiny is the same. There is a link that shares us, whether it's dictatorship, whether it's a dream of having stability. Like sometimes even if the pain would divide us, the dream might unite us in a way. I hope I answered your question.
Ade, do we have time for one more? Okay. Question in the back.
Thank you. My name is Daniela Montemoreno. I'm from Georgetown University's Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. So as Marty Griffiths pursues this negotiated settlement, can you evaluate the role that an amnesty agreement, either a conditional or unconditional amnesty agreement, would have an impact on the pursuit of justice for war crimes and crimes against humanity?
I'm certainly not the expert in this issue, but I'll do my best to answer. I just think there's always a constant tension between reconciliation and accountability, right? And I think it's always a matter of finding that right balance. And the answer, in my opinion, to your question is that should be determined by Yemenis who are sitting at the table, who have a vested interest in a long-term peace in Yemen and a future state. And that there has been a distraction over the years that if we just get the coalition to sit down with Hadi and the Houthis, everything will be resolved. We don't need to deal with any other parties. Actually, it's been said bringing in other parties would make it too complicated. We don't want to, kill this effort when it's finally getting legs. And I think that will end up like a situation where you have in Syria, that the peace process is not representative of the key stakeholders in the country. So I'll leave it there, but my assessment is that there probably needs to be a kind of two-part process where you end the internationalization of the civil war, and then you move on to a negotiated settlement between the Yemeni parties themselves. What do you think?
Any other comments?
Do you want to come? To be honest, sorry if I sound pessimistic, but I'm more scared of the solution, the potential solution, than the problem. The problem kind of keeps the conversation going. Doesn't mean that I don't want to advocate for the end of the war, but what kind of political settlement will we have? Is it a political settlement that would transfer the de facto atrocities and authorities on the ground to de jure? Will the Houthis stay in control of the north? Will the militias founded by Emiratis in the Janub, what kind of political process? And then the end of the war does not mean the end of the conflict, because usually the connotation made when it comes to the Yemen conflict, if Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis withdraw from the country, the war would stop. Nope. The Saudi-led coalition's bombardment and airstrikes will end, but the Yemeni conflict will not. So we need to renegotiate openly, honestly, what are the terms of the future? Because we're talking again, I'm going to repeat again and again and again, the Houthis are supremacists. They do not believe in equal citizenry. They do not believe in equal participation. They do not believe in peaceful transition of power, because as a doctrine to them, the way to reach power is through declaring holy war. If you believe, that is their doctrine. That is actually mentioned in their manifesto published in 2012, when they said, we are the chosen race by God, and we believe in the Zaydi Hadawi religio-political theory, which gives them the divine intel. They did not mention the constitution. They did not mention the law. They believe in their own religious laws. So what are the laws that will govern Yemen in the transitional period? What kind of transitional justice the country will have? What about the republic? So I feel like the first step to really build a transitional justice that would lead to sustainable peace is having all parties in the negotiation table, in the political negotiation table, declaring the principles of full, equal humanity between all citizens of Yemen under principles of constitutionalism, equal citizenry, and the rule of law. Other than that, the Houthis, if they are even removed from the scene, there will be another Houthis, another family declaring, I don't know what kind of religio-political authority they want to. So for me, it's sustainable peace and justice, an end of conflict, not end of bombardment, like conflict.
A sobering panel, to be sure. This afternoon, we will be talking about remedies and relief. But I very much want to thank all of the speakers. It's an incredibly complex problem, and they have helped to unknot it for us a little bit. So I want to thank Ambassador Rapp and Professor Crane and all of the panelists here for an extraordinary session. Thank you all for being here.